Tonight we uncover a secret that has shaped kingdoms, toppled governments, and guided the fate of nations for nearly 5 centuries. Hidden within the halls of the Vatican, encrypted in letters that crossed continents, and whispered in confessionals from Beijing to Buenos Aires, lies a language known only to a chosen few. They call themselves the Society of Jesus, but the world knows them as the Jesuits, and their cipher, their secret tongue, remains one of history's most carefully guarded mysteries. This is not about religious doctrine or theological debates. This is about power, because when you can communicate in perfect secrecy, while your enemies listen in vain, when your messages travel undetected through the hands of kings and emperors, when your true intentions remain hidden behind layers of code that have never been fully broken, you hold an advantage that can reshape the world. And that is exactly what the Jesuits have done. For centuries, scholars have wondered how a relatively small religious order managed to infiltrate royal courts, influence papal decisions, survive persecution across multiple continents, and emerge stronger after every attempt to destroy them. The answer lies not in their vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. It lies in their mastery of something far more valuable than gold or armies: information, and more importantly, the ability to share that information without anyone else understanding a single word. So, before you dismiss this as another tale of religious intrigue, ask yourself this question. What if the most powerful intelligence network in history was not created by governments or empires, but by men in black robes who swore allegiance to something higher than any earthly throne? What if their secret language still echoes in diplomatic cables, corporate boardrooms, and the corridors of power today? Like the video, subscribe, because tonight we step into a world where Latin prayers mask coded instructions, where mathematical formulas hide political strategies, and where the phrase ad majorem Dei gloriam might mean something entirely different than anyone ever imagined. The story begins in Paris, in the year 1534, when a young Spanish soldier named Ignatius of Loyola gathered 6 companions in the crypt of the Montmartre chapel. They took vows, they pledged their lives to service, and they founded what would become the most influential religious order in Christian history. But what history books rarely mention is that from their very first meeting, these men spoke in a way that no one else could understand. It was not Latin, though they used Latin words. It was not Spanish, though most of them were Spanish. It was something new, something deliberately crafted to ensure that their communications could never be intercepted, never be decoded, and never be used against them by their enemies. Because even in that candlelit crypt, they knew they would have enemies, powerful ones. Within a decade of their founding, the Jesuits had spread across Europe, established missions in India and Japan, and gained the ear of popes and princes. Their rise was meteoric, almost supernatural in its speed and precision. But what allowed them to coordinate their efforts across such vast distances, in an age when a letter from Rome to Manila might take 2 years to arrive? How did they ensure that sensitive instructions reached their intended recipients without falling into the wrong hands? The answer emerged slowly, hidden in archives that were sealed for centuries. In the dusty corners of Jesuit colleges, scholars began to find letters that looked normal on the surface, but contained strange patterns, words that seemed out of place, mathematical notations that made no sense in context, references to saints and scripture that followed no logical sequence. These were not mistakes or coincidences. They were breadcrumbs, leading to something much larger. One such letter, discovered in the archives of the Collegio Romano in 1968, appeared to be a routine report from a missionary in China to his superior in Rome. On the surface, it described baptisms, local customs, and requests for additional supplies. But when a Jesuit archivist noticed that certain words were underlined in a seemingly random pattern, he began to see something else entirely. The underlined words, when read in sequence, spelled out detailed intelligence about Chinese military movements, political tensions at the imperial court, and the locations of silver mines that would be worth millions in today's currency. This was no isolated incident. Similar patterns began to appear in letters from India, from the Americas, from every corner of the globe where Jesuits had established a presence. They were not just missionaries. They were intelligence operatives, gathering information and transmitting it through a communication system so sophisticated that it would not be matched by government agencies for another 400 years. The Jesuit Cipher, as cryptographers later named it, was not a single code, but a complex system of interlocking methods. At its simplest level, it involved the substitution of certain words with apparently innocent alternatives. A reference to the harvest might actually mean military preparations. Prayer vigils could indicate political unrest. Donations from benefactors often described the movement of gold and silver from colonial mines, but the system went much deeper than simple word substitution. The Jesuits developed what modern analysts would recognize as a form of steganography, the art of hiding messages within other messages. They embedded coded instructions within treatises, disguised political intelligence as reports on local festivals, and concealed financial information in accounts of religious ceremonies. To the casual observer, their letters were exactly what they appeared to be. To those who knew how to read between the lines, they were something else entirely. The mathematical component of the cipher was perhaps the most ingenious aspect of the system. Jesuit education placed heavy emphasis on mathematics and astronomy, subjects that were considered both practical and spiritually significant. But this mathematical training served another purpose. Numbers could be embedded in seemingly innocent contexts. A reference to the 12 apostles might actually indicate coordinates. The 7 sacraments could specify a date. Trinity might designate a particular individual or location. Even more sophisticated was their use of what they called scriptural coordinates. The Jesuits were masters of biblical scholarship, and their letters were naturally filled with references to Scripture. But these followed patterns that only other Jesuits would recognize. A citation of Matthew, chapter 16, verse 18, might seem like a natural way to discuss the founding of the Church. But to a trained reader, it could indicate a specific person, place, or instruction, based on a system of associations that had been memorized by every member of the order. The beauty of this system was its deniability. If intercepted and questioned about a letter, a Jesuit could truthfully claim that he was simply discussing religious matters. The mathematical references were part of his scholarly interests. The scriptural citations reflected his devotion to study. There was no smoking gun, no obvious code that could be pointed to as evidence of espionage or political interference. This deniability became crucial as the Jesuits accumulated enemies. Their influence grew rapidly, but so did suspicion about their methods and motives. Kings and nobles, who had initially welcomed them as spiritual advisors, began to wonder whether these men in black robes might be serving interests other than the salvation of souls. Protestant nations viewed them as agents of papal infiltration. Even within the Catholic Church, rival orders and secular clergy questioned whether the Jesuits had grown too powerful, too secretive, too independent. By the 17th century, rumors of Jesuit conspiracies were spreading across Europe. They were accused of regicide, of political manipulation, of using the confessional to extract state secrets from powerful penitents. Some of these accusations were paranoid fantasies. Others, as we now know, were remarkably close to the truth. But the Jesuits' cipher system allowed them to coordinate their responses to these threats, while maintaining plausible deniability about their true activities. The first serious attempt to crack the Jesuit cipher came from an unexpected source. In 1661, Blaise Pascal, the French mathematician and philosopher, became embroiled in a theological dispute with Jesuit scholars. As he researched their writings for ammunition in this debate, he began to notice the same patterns that would later catch the attention of 20th century cryptographers. Pascal's mathematical mind was ideally suited to recognize the numerical sequences and geometric relationships hidden within Jesuit texts. Pascal never published his findings about the cipher, but his private notes, discovered centuries later, reveal that he had made significant progress in understanding at least some aspects of the system. He identified several key patterns and even managed to decode portions of letters that had been preserved in French archives. His work suggests that the Jesuit cipher was not unbreakable, but it was sophisticated enough to require mathematical expertise and considerable time to penetrate. More significantly, Pascal's notes indicate that the cipher was not static. It evolved with new elements being added and old ones being modified or abandoned. This suggests a level of organizational discipline and security consciousness that was unprecedented in the 17th century. The Jesuits were not simply using a code they had learned. They were actively managing and updating their communication security in response to changing threats. The implications of this discovery were staggering. It meant that the Jesuits had developed, centuries before the age of modern intelligence agencies, many of the fundamental techniques of espionage tradecraft. They understood the importance of operational security, the need for multiple fallback systems, and the value of continuous innovation in their methods. They had, in essence, created the template for every intelligence service that would follow. But the most remarkable aspect of the Jesuit cipher was not its technical sophistication. It was its integration into the daily life and spiritual practice of the order. Unlike government codes, which were used only for sensitive communications, the Jesuit system was woven into every aspect of their correspondence. Letters between friends contained hidden meanings. Requests for supplies carried political intelligence. Even personal spiritual reflections could conceal strategic information. This integration served multiple purposes. It made the cipher system virtually undetectable to outsiders, since there was no clear boundary between coded and uncoded communications. It also ensured that every member of the order, regardless of his specific role or assignment, was contributing to the collective intelligence effort. A missionary teaching children in a remote village might inadvertently gather information that would be valuable to Jesuit strategists in Rome. A confessor listening to the spiritual struggles of a government official might learn details that could influence papal policy. The psychological effect of this system on the Jesuits themselves was profound. They knew that their words carried multiple layers of meaning, that their seemingly routine correspondence was part of a vast network of information gathering and analysis. This knowledge created a sense of participation in something larger than themselves, something that transcended the boundaries of individual missions or assignments. Every Jesuit was not just a priest or teacher or missionary. He was also an intelligence operative, a keeper of secrets, a guardian of information that could reshape the balance of power in the world. This understanding would become crucial as the 18th century brought new challenges to the Society of Jesus. Enlightenment philosophers began to question the role of religious orders in modern society. Powerful monarchs, influenced by new ideas about state sovereignty, began to view the Jesuits' international character as a threat to national interests. The stage was being set for the most dramatic test of the Jesuit cipher system, a test that would determine not just the fate of a religious order, but the future of secret communication itself. The crisis began in Portugal in the year 1750, with an event that would send shockwaves through European courts and ultimately lead to one of the most dramatic tests of the Jesuit cipher system in its history. King Joseph I, influenced by his powerful minister the Marquis de Pombal, accused the Jesuits of inciting rebellion in their South American missions and interfering with colonial trade. But the real issue was deeper than colonial politics. The Portuguese crown had discovered that Jesuit communications were reaching Rome faster than their own diplomatic correspondence. How was this possible? The answer lay in the sophistication of the Jesuit network. While government dispatches followed official routes, subject to inspection at borders and delays at customs houses, Jesuit letters travelled through a parallel system that had been refined over 2 centuries. Their cipher allowed them to embed urgent intelligence in routine religious correspondence, which moved freely between monasteries, colleges, and missions without attracting attention from secular authorities. When Portuguese agents finally intercepted a series of Jesuit letters in 1752, they found themselves staring at what appeared to be nothing more than theological discussions about the proper celebration of feast days. But cryptographers working for Pombal suspected there was more beneath the surface. They had heard rumours of the Jesuit cipher from contacts in other European courts. Whispered stories of codes hidden within prayers and intelligence networks disguised as missionary reports. The breakthrough came when they realized that the Jesuits were using a technique that would not be formally recognized by intelligence agencies until the 20th century. They called it compartmentalization. Different levels of operatives had access to different aspects of the cipher system. A simple parish priest might know only basic word substitutions. A provincial superior would understand more complex numerical codes. Only the highest levels of the order had access to the complete system, with all its interlocking elements and fail-safe mechanisms. This compartmentalization made the cipher incredibly difficult to break, because no single captured document could reveal the entire system. Even if interrogators managed to extract some information from a Jesuit operative, they would only glimpse one small piece of a much larger puzzle. The Portuguese discovered this frustrating reality when they arrested several Jesuits and subjected them to intensive questioning. Each man could reveal only fragments of the system, pieces that seemed to contradict each other and lead nowhere. But Pombal was persistent, and he had resources that previous enemies of the Jesuits had lacked. He established what was essentially the first modern code-breaking operation, bringing together mathematicians, linguists, and scholars from across Europe to focus on the Jesuit cipher. Their work, conducted in secret chambers beneath Lisbon Castle, would influence the development of cryptography for centuries to come. The team made their first significant discovery when they realized that Jesuit letters contained what they termed temporal anchors, references to specific dates and events that could be used to establish the context for coded messages. A letter dated on the feast of St. Ignatius might use different substitution patterns than one written during Lent. References to particular saints could indicate which variant of the cipher was being employed. Even the quality of paper and ink contained information that trained readers could interpret. More disturbing still was their discovery that the Jesuits had been using what modern intelligence agencies would recognize as sleeper cells. Jesuit colleges across Europe contained operatives who appeared to be simple teachers or administrators, but were actually maintaining sophisticated intelligence networks. These men corresponded regularly with contacts throughout the continent, gathering information about political developments, military preparations, and economic conditions. All of this intelligence flowed back to Rome through the cipher system, giving the Vatican unprecedented insight into European affairs. The Portuguese investigation revealed that Jesuit operatives had infiltrated royal courts, not just as confessors, but as tutors, librarians, and advisors. They had access to state papers, diplomatic correspondence, and private conversations between monarchs and their ministers. Through the cipher system, this information was systematically collected and analysed, creating an intelligence capability that rivaled anything possessed by secular governments. Perhaps most shocking was the discovery that the Jesuits had been using their missionary activities as cover for what could only be described as commercial espionage. Letters from Jesuit missions in Asia and the Americas contained detailed information about natural resources, trade routes, and local political conditions. This intelligence was being used not just to advance Catholic interests, but to influence European investment and colonial policy. The Society of Jesus had become, in effect, the world's first multinational intelligence corporation, The Portuguese findings were quickly shared with other European courts, where they confirmed suspicions that had been building for decades. In France, Madame de Pompadour had long suspected that her Jesuit confessor was reporting her private conversations to Rome. In Austria, Empress Maria Theresa had noticed that papal policies seemed to anticipate her diplomatic initiatives with uncanny accuracy. In Spain, courtiers whispered that the Jesuits knew about government decisions before they were officially announced. But the most damaging revelation concerned the Jesuits' financial activities. The cipher system had allowed them to coordinate investments across multiple continents, using information gathered through their missionary network to make extraordinarily profitable trades. They had advanced knowledge of silver discoveries in Peru, spice harvests in Ceylon, and political changes that would affect commodity prices throughout Europe. This information, transmitted through their secret language, had made the Society of Jesus one of the wealthiest organizations in the world. The financial aspect of the Jesuit cipher was perhaps its most sophisticated element. They had developed methods for encoding numerical information that were centuries ahead of their time. Exchange rates, cargo manifests, and market prices could all be hidden within seemingly innocent religious correspondence. A letter describing the spiritual progress of converts might actually contain detailed financial projections. References to biblical passages could indicate specific investments or trading opportunities. This financial intelligence network gave the Jesuits enormous influence over European banking and commerce. They could predict market movements, influence currency fluctuations, and coordinate investments across vast distances with a precision that secular merchants could only dream of. Their wealth, in turn, funded their educational and missionary activities, creating a self-reinforcing cycle of influence and information gathering. By 1755, the evidence against the Jesuits had become overwhelming. Courts across Europe were sharing intelligence about the cipher system, and patterns were emerging that could no longer be explained away as coincidence. The Society of Jesus was not simply a religious order. It was a multinational organization with capabilities that threatened the sovereignty of individual nations and the stability of European politics. The response was swift and coordinated. Portugal expelled the Jesuits in 1759. France followed in 1764. Spain and its colonies banished them in 1767. By 1770, pressure was mounting on Pope Clement XIV to suppress the entire order. The Jesuit cipher, which had been their greatest strength, had ultimately become the evidence of their downfall, but the Jesuits had anticipated this possibility. As the persecution intensified, they activated contingency plans that had been centuries in the making. The cipher system itself began to evolve, becoming even more sophisticated as it went underground. New methods of communication were developed. Alternative networks were established. The Society of Jesus might be officially suppressed, but its intelligence capabilities would survive in forms that its enemies could not even imagine. The suppression of the Jesuits in 1773 marked the end of one chapter in the history of secret communication, but it was also the beginning of another. The techniques they had developed, the networks they had established, and the lessons they had learned about the power of information would influence intelligence operations for centuries to come. Their cipher had not been broken. It had simply evolved, adapting to new circumstances with the same ingenuity that had made it so effective in the first place. The years following the suppression brought unexpected revelations about the true scope of the Jesuit cipher system. As governments seized Jesuit properties and ransacked their archives, cryptographers across Europe made discoveries that defied everything they thought they knew about secret communication. Hidden compartments in college libraries revealed documents that suggested the cipher was not merely a tool for espionage, but something far more ambitious. The Jesuits had been attempting to create what they called the universal language, a system of communication that could transcend national boundaries, cultural differences, and even time itself. In a sealed vault beneath the Jesuit Church in Rome, papal investigators found manuscripts that outlined theoretical frameworks for encoding not just words and numbers, but concepts, emotions, and abstract philosophical ideas. These documents, written in a mixture of Latin, mathematical notation, and symbolic diagrams, suggested that the Jesuits viewed their cipher as more than a practical necessity. They saw it as a path toward perfect communication, a way to eliminate the ambiguity and misunderstanding that plagued human discourse. The implications were staggering. If successful, such a system would allow its users to share complex ideas with absolute precision, regardless of their native language or cultural background. Political concepts could be transmitted without the distortion that came from translation. Scientific discoveries could be communicated without the risk of misinterpretation. Military strategies could be coordinated across vast distances with mathematical certainty. But the manuscripts also revealed something else. The Jesuits had been experimenting with what they termed temporal encoding, methods of embedding messages that would only become intelligible at specific future dates. They had developed techniques for creating communications that would remain meaningless until certain conditions were met, certain events had occurred, or certain astronomical alignments had taken place. These time-locked messages were scattered throughout their correspondence, waiting to be activated by readers who possessed the proper keys. French cryptographers working under the direction of the Duc de Choiseul made the first breakthrough in understanding these temporal codes. They discovered that certain Jesuit letters contained mathematical sequences that corresponded to astronomical calculations. When these calculations were worked out, they revealed future dates. And when those dates arrived, previously meaningless passages in the letters would suddenly make perfect sense, revealing instructions, prophecies, or strategic guidance that had been hidden for years or even decades. The discovery sent shockwaves through European courts. It suggested that the Jesuits had not simply been gathering intelligence about current events, they had been attempting to influence future events, embedding instructions in their communications that would only be understood when the time was right to act upon them. Some of these messages had apparently been planted decades earlier, waiting to guide Jesuit activities long after their authors had died. Even more disturbing were the implications for the suppression itself. Analysis of captured documents suggested that Jesuit leadership had anticipated their persecution and had embedded contingency plans throughout their cipher system. Messages that seemed to be routine correspondence from the 1740s and 50s contained detailed instructions for what to do if the order was dissolved. Safe houses were identified. Alternative communication networks were established. Financial resources were hidden in locations that could only be decoded from seemingly innocent religious texts. The sophistication of these preparations suggested a level of strategic thinking that impressed even their enemies. Cardinal Alessandro Albani, who had played a key role in the suppression, privately admitted that the Jesuits had demonstrated organizational capabilities that surpassed those of most governments. Their cipher system had allowed them to coordinate activities across multiple generations, ensuring continuity even in the face of catastrophic disruption. But perhaps the most remarkable discovery came from an unexpected source. In 1776, Benjamin Franklin, serving as American ambassador to France, encountered a former Jesuit who claimed to possess knowledge of the cipher system. The man, who identified himself only as Father Antoine, approached Franklin with an offer to share certain aspects of the Jesuit communication methods in exchange for safe passage to the American colonies. Franklin, whose own interests in cryptography were well known, agreed to the exchange. What he learned in a series of clandestine meetings in Paris would influence American intelligence operations for generations to come. Father Antoine revealed that the Jesuits had developed methods for hiding messages, not just in written text, but in architectural features, musical compositions, and even the arrangement of books on library shelves. Entire buildings could serve as encoded messages, their proportions and decorative elements containing information that could only be read by those who understood the system. The implications for the American Revolution were immediate. Franklin realized that the Jesuits' techniques could be adapted to coordinate resistance activities across the 13 colonies. Messages could be hidden in church sermons, embedded in commercial correspondence, or encoded in the design of public buildings. The British authorities, even if they suspected such activities, would find it nearly impossible to detect communications that were hidden in plain sight. Franklin shared these insights with other members of the Continental Congress, including Thomas Jefferson and John Adams. Both men were fascinated by the possibilities and began experimenting with adapted versions of Jesuit techniques in their own correspondence. Jefferson, in particular, became skilled at embedding coded messages in his philosophical writings, using techniques that bore clear resemblance to methods developed by the Society of Jesus. The influence of Jesuit cipher techniques on American intelligence operations became even more apparent during the early years of the Republic. The network of Masonic lodges that played such an important role in American politics bore striking similarities to the Jesuit college system, with its emphasis on secrecy, loyalty, and the careful management of information. Many of the founding fathers who were active Masons had clearly studied and adapted Jesuit methods of secret communication. But the most significant long-term impact of the Jesuit cipher was its influence on the development of modern cryptography. The techniques they had pioneered, particularly their use of steganography and their integration of mathematical principles into communication security, would be rediscovered and refined by intelligence agencies centuries later. During World War II, Allied codebreakers studying captured German communications found evidence that Nazi cryptographers had been influenced by analysis of historical Jesuit methods. The German interest in Jesuit cryptography had begun during the 19th century, when Prussian scholars gained access to previously secret Vatican archives. They discovered that many techniques used by modern intelligence services had been anticipated by Jesuit communicators centuries earlier. The concept of one-time pads, the use of null characters to disguise message length, the embedding of codes within apparently innocent text, all of these methods could be found in Jesuit correspondence from the 16th and 17th centuries. Soviet intelligence services also showed interest in Jesuit techniques, particularly their methods for maintaining security across large, geographically dispersed organizations. KGB training manuals from the Cold War era contained references to ecclesiastical protocols that were clearly derived from studies of Jesuit operational methods. The ability to coordinate activities across multiple time zones while maintaining operational security was a challenge that both the Society of Jesus and modern intelligence agencies had to solve. The digital age has brought new relevance to Jesuit cipher techniques. Computer scientists studying historical cryptography have found that many Jesuit methods anticipate principles that are fundamental to modern encryption. Their use of layered encoding, where messages contained multiple levels of hidden meaning, parallels the structure of modern computer security protocols. Their emphasis on compartmentalization and need-to-know principles has become standard practice in contemporary intelligence operations. Even more intriguing are recent discoveries suggesting that some Jesuit cipher techniques may have influenced the development of early computer programming languages. Grace Hopper, one of the pioneers of computer programming, had studied medieval and Renaissance cryptography as part of her mathematical training. Her approach to creating human-readable programming languages bore clear similarities to Jesuit methods for embedding coded instructions within apparently normal text. The influence extends into contemporary corporate and diplomatic communication as well. Modern executives and diplomats often use techniques that can be traced back to Jesuit innovations. The practice of embedding sensitive information in routine business correspondence, the use of seemingly innocent cultural references to convey complex strategic information, and the coordination of activities across multiple organizations through carefully crafted public statements, all echo methods developed by the Society of Jesus centuries ago. Financial markets have also adopted techniques that mirror Jesuit practices. high-frequency trading algorithms use methods for detecting patterns in apparently random data that are remarkably similar to techniques Jesuit analysts use to extract intelligence from routine correspondence. The ability to process vast amounts of information and identify subtle signals amidst noise was as valuable to 17th-century Jesuit strategists as it is to contemporary quantitative analysts. But perhaps the most significant legacy of the Jesuit cipher lies in its demonstration that information, properly managed and protected, could be more powerful than armies or treasuries. The Society of Jesus proved that a relatively small organization could influence global events through superior intelligence gathering and communication security. This lesson was not lost on later organizations that sought to exercise influence beyond their apparent resources. The restoration of the Jesuits in 1814 marked the beginning of a new chapter in the evolution of their cipher system. When Pope Pius VII signed the bull Solicitudo Omnium Ecclesiarum, officially re-establishing the Society of Jesus, he was not simply restoring a religious order. He was reactivating what had become the most sophisticated intelligence network in history, one that had spent 41 years underground, refining and perfecting its methods of secret communication. During the suppression, surviving Jesuits had not remained idle. In Russia, where Catherine the Great had refused to enforce the papal ban, they had continued their work under the protection of the Orthodox crown. In Prussia, former Jesuits had established what they called academic societies that maintained many of their communication practices under secular cover. In the Americas, ex-Jesuits had integrated themselves into educational and commercial networks, preserving their cipher techniques through informal channels that connected Boston to Buenos Aires. When these scattered fragments of the order were reunited, they brought with them innovations that had been developed in isolation. Russian Jesuits had perfected methods for embedding codes in orthodox liturgical texts. Prussian academics had learned to hide intelligence within scientific papers and mathematical proofs. American operatives had mastered the art of commercial cipher, encoding strategic information within shipping manifests and trade correspondence. The synthesis of these techniques created a cipher system that was far more sophisticated than anything that had existed before the suppression. The new Jesuit code incorporated elements drawn from advances in mathematics, linguistics, and natural philosophy that had occurred during the late 18th and early 19th centuries. They had studied the work of Euler, absorbed insights from comparative linguistics, and integrated new understanding of probability theory into their encryption methods. More significantly, they had learned from the mistakes that had led to their downfall. The restored society implemented what they termed defensive compartmentalization, ensuring that no single individual or institution could possess enough knowledge of the cipher system to compromise the entire network. Regional variations were introduced so that messages intercepted in one part of the world could not be used to decode communications elsewhere. Temporal elements were made more complex, with some messages requiring multiple keys that would only become available years apart. The Industrial Revolution provided new opportunities for concealment that the Jesuits were quick to exploit. Railway timetables could contain coded meeting schedules. Telegraph messages, with their abbreviated syntax, provided perfect cover for cipher communications. Factory production reports could hide information about political developments. The mechanical precision of industrial processes allowed for new forms of steganography that would have been impossible in earlier centuries. Jesuit colleges, which had always been centers of learning, became laboratories for cryptographic innovation. Mathematics professors, who were secretly members of the order, developed new theoretical frameworks for encoding information. Physics instructors experimented with ways of using light and sound. Even literature professors contributed, creating new methods for embedding codes within poetry and prose that could survive translation into multiple languages. The expansion of global trade in the 19th century gave the restored Jesuits unprecedented opportunities to gather and disseminate intelligence. Their educational institutions produced graduates who went on to careers in banking, commerce, and government service. These alumni, bound by loyalty to their teachers and their shared intellectual heritage, became informal intelligence assets who could provide information about political and economic developments worldwide. The cipher system adapted to accommodate this new reality. Methods were developed for encoding information about commodity prices, currency fluctuations, and trade negotiations. Financial intelligence became as important as political intelligence, and the Jesuits' ability to predict economic trends gave them influence that extended far beyond religious matters. Banks in London learned to watch for subtle signals in Jesuit publications that might indicate changes in papal monetary policy. Merchants in Hamburg paid attention to seemingly innocent references in Jesuit letters that could reveal information about harvest conditions in distant colonies. This economic dimension of the cipher system proved particularly valuable as European powers competed for global dominance throughout the 19th century. The Jesuits' missionary activities gave them access to information about colonial developments that was often more accurate and more timely than what reached government offices in European capitals. A Jesuit letter describing baptisms in the Philippines might actually contain intelligence about Spanish military preparations. A report on educational progress in India could hide information about British commercial policies that would affect trade throughout Asia. The American Civil War provided a crucial test of the evolved cipher system. Jesuits on both sides of the conflict found themselves in possession of intelligence that could influence the outcome of battles. Georgetown University, founded by Jesuits in Washington, became an unofficial intelligence center where information from across the continent was collected and analyzed. The cipher system allowed Jesuit operatives to maintain communication even as armies moved across the landscape, disrupting normal postal services and telegraph lines. More importantly, the war demonstrated that the Jesuit cipher could function effectively even when its operators were divided by political loyalties. Northern and Southern Jesuits might support different causes, but they continued to share certain types of information through their traditional communication channels. Intelligence about troop movements was kept secret, but information about civilian conditions, supply shortages, and political developments continued to flow through the cipher network, creating a form of intelligence sharing that transcended the boundaries of the conflict. The aftermath of the Civil War saw the Jesuits playing an increasingly important role in American society. Their colleges expanded rapidly, their graduates took positions of influence in government and business, and their cipher system adapted to the realities of American democracy. The challenge was different from what they had faced in European monarchies. Instead of influencing a single ruler, they needed to coordinate activities across a complex system of competing interests and institutions. The solution was characteristically elegant. The Jesuits developed what they called democratic cipher, a system that allowed for the encoding of information about public opinion, electoral trends, and legislative developments. They learned to read the subtle signals that indicated how political winds were shifting, and they developed methods for influencing those winds through carefully timed communications and strategic interventions. By the 1870s, European intelligence services had become aware that the restored Jesuits possessed communication capabilities that rivaled their own. British intelligence, which had been monitoring Jesuit activities since the order's restoration, reported that Jesuit letters appeared to contain information that reached London faster than official diplomatic correspondence. French security services noted similar patterns, observing that papal policies seemed to anticipate French political developments with suspicious accuracy. The response was a new wave of investigation, led by intelligence professionals who understood cryptography far better than their 18th century predecessors. These investigators had access to new analytical tools, including statistical methods for detecting patterns in large volumes of text. They approached the Jesuit cipher as a professional challenge, bringing systematic methods to bear on what had previously been approached through intuition and guesswork. The results were both revealing and frustrating. The new investigators confirmed that the Jesuits were indeed using sophisticated cipher methods, but they discovered that the system had evolved far beyond what they had expected. The simple word Substitutions and numerical codes that had been identified in the 18th century were still present, but they were now embedded within multiple layers of more complex encryption. Breaking one level of the code only revealed another level beneath it, like nested Russian dolls that seemed to extend infinitely inward. Even more challenging was the discovery that the cipher system was no longer static. It was actively managed and continuously updated by what appeared to be a dedicated cryptographic organization within the Society of Jesus. New methods were introduced regularly, old methods were modified or abandoned, and the entire system evolved in response to changing circumstances and emerging threats. The Jesuits had essentially created the world's first professional intelligence service, complete with research and development capabilities that allowed it to stay ahead of its opponents. The German Empire, under Otto von Bismarck, made the most systematic attempt to penetrate the Jesuit Cipher during the Kulturkampf of the 1870s. Prussian codebreakers, working with resources and methods that surpassed anything available in the 18th century, spent years analyzing intercepted Jesuit communications. They made significant progress in understanding certain aspects of the system, particularly the mathematical elements that had been refined since the Restoration. But their ultimate conclusion was sobering. The Jesuit Cipher was not simply a communication tool. It was an integral part of the organization's identity and operational method. Breaking the code would require not just cryptographic skill, but fundamental understanding of Jesuit psychology, theology, and institutional culture. The cipher drew its strength not just from mathematical complexity, but from the shared intellectual heritage and spiritual commitment that bound the society together. This realization marked a turning point in how intelligence services approached the challenge of secret communication. The Prussian investigation demonstrated that effective cryptography required more than technical innovation. It required organizational discipline, cultural coherence, and long-term institutional commitment. These were qualities that religious orders could sustain more easily than government agencies, which were subject to political changes and budgetary constraints. The lesson was not lost on other intelligence services. Throughout the late 19th century, European governments began to study Jesuit organizational methods as models for their own intelligence operations. The concept of deep cover, the use of educational institutions as intelligence platforms, the integration of economic and political intelligence, all of these techniques that would become standard in 20th century espionage had been pioneered and refined by the Society of Jesus. The 20th century brought challenges that would test the Jesuit cipher system in ways its creators could never have anticipated. 2 world wars, the rise of fascist and communist ideologies, and the emergence of electronic surveillance created an environment where traditional methods of secret communication faced unprecedented scrutiny. Yet rather than abandoning their centuries-old system, the Jesuits once again demonstrated their remarkable ability to adapt and evolve. The outbreak of World War I found Jesuit operatives on both sides of the conflict, their loyalties divided between national obligations and religious unity. This presented a unique challenge for the cipher system. How could an organization maintain secure communications when its members were literally shooting at each other across the trenches of the Western Front? The solution revealed the true genius of Jesuit cryptography. They had developed what intelligence professionals would later recognize as the first successful implementation of compartmented communication networks. German Jesuits continued to communicate with their counterparts in France and England, but through carefully designed protocols that prevented military intelligence from crossing enemy lines. Personal spiritual matters could be discussed freely. Information about civilian conditions and humanitarian needs flowed without restriction. But operational military intelligence was filtered through a system of ethical barriers that had been built into the cipher itself. The code contained moral governors that prevented its use for purposes that contradicted fundamental Jesuit principles. This ethical dimension of the cipher system had been present from the beginning, but it became crucial during the Great War. Jesuit communications could carry information about troop movements, but only if that information would be used to minimize civilian casualties or provide medical assistance to wounded soldiers. Intelligence about military strategies could be shared, but only if it served humanitarian purposes rather than tactical advantages. The war also revealed another remarkable feature of the evolved cipher system. It had become self-modifying, capable of changing its own parameters in response to external conditions. When traditional postal services were disrupted by military operations, the system automatically shifted to alternative communication channels. When telegraph lines were cut, coded messages began appearing in newspaper advertisements and commercial announcements. The cipher had developed what modern computer scientists would recognize as distributed intelligence, the ability to function effectively even when large portions of the network were damaged or destroyed. French intelligence officers, analyzing intercepted German communications, began to notice something strange in late 1917. Messages that appeared to be routine business correspondence contained mathematical anomalies that suggested hidden content. But when these messages were subjected to standard cryptographic analysis, no coherent intelligence emerged. The breakthrough came when a French analyst realized that the coded information was not hidden within individual messages, but distributed across multiple communications that might be separated by weeks or months. This discovery led to the identification of what the French termed constellation ciphering, a technique where sensitive information was scattered across numerous apparently unrelated messages like stars in the night sky. Only someone who possessed the proper temporal and geographical keys could connect the scattered elements into meaningful intelligence. The Jesuits had essentially created a form of cryptographic time travel, embedding information in the past that would only become useful in the future. The implications were staggering. It meant that Jesuit intelligence capabilities were not limited by the speed of communication or the efficiency of their networks. They could plant information years in advance, creating intelligence resources that would become available precisely when they were needed. A casual conversation recorded in a seminary in 1910 might contain the key to understanding a coded message sent from the Vatican in 1918. The Russian Revolution provided another test of the cipher system's adaptability. When the Bolsheviks seized power and began their systematic campaign against religious organizations, Russian Jesuits found themselves cut off from normal communication channels with Rome. Traditional diplomatic and ecclesiastical networks were either destroyed or compromised. Yet intelligence continued to flow from the Soviet Union to Vatican City through channels that Soviet security services could never identify. The solution involved techniques that would not be formally recognized by intelligence agencies until decades later. Jesuit operatives in Russia began using what they called cultural camouflage, hiding coded messages within artistic and literary works that could cross international boundaries without attracting official attention. A painting sold to a collector in Paris might contain geometric patterns that encoded information about political conditions in Moscow. A musical composition performed in Berlin could carry rhythmic patterns that conveyed intelligence about Soviet industrial production. These cultural communication methods proved remarkably resistant to detection because they operated on aesthetic rather than linguistic principles. Soviet censors might understand that a particular poem or painting contained subversive political content, but they could not identify the specific intelligence value of geometric relationships or musical intervals. The cipher had evolved beyond language itself, becoming a system of pure information transfer that could function regardless of cultural or linguistic barriers. The rise of Nazi Germany in the 1930s created the most serious threat the Jesuit cipher system had ever faced. Hitler's regime possessed unprecedented surveillance capabilities and had demonstrated a willingness to use extreme methods against perceived enemies. More significantly, Nazi intelligence services had made a systematic study of historical cryptographic methods, including detailed analysis of captured 18th century documents related to the Jesuit cipher. The challenge was compounded by the fact that many prominent Jesuits were actively involved in resistance activities throughout occupied Europe. Their cipher system was not simply a tool for gathering intelligence, it had become a coordination mechanism for underground networks that were working to undermine Nazi control. The stakes could not have been higher. Discovery of the cipher's methods would not just compromise intelligence operations, it would lead to the arrest, torture, and execution of hundreds of resistance operatives. The Jesuit response was characteristically sophisticated. Instead of abandoning their traditional methods, they created what intelligence historians would later recognize as the first successful implementation of false cipher techniques. They deliberately allowed Nazi codebreakers to discover certain aspects of their communication system, but these were carefully designed decoy methods that concealed the true cipher beneath multiple layers of misdirection. Nazi cryptographers, believing they had cracked the Jesuit code, began intercepting and analyzing communications that appeared to contain valuable intelligence about Vatican policies and resistance activities. In reality, these messages were part of an elaborate deception operation designed to feed false information to German intelligence services while protecting the real communication networks that continued to operate undetected. The false cipher operation was so successful that it influenced German strategic decisions throughout the war. Nazi planners, believing they had accurate intelligence about Vatican intentions, made policy choices based on information that had been carefully crafted to serve Allied interests. The Jesuits had essentially turned their own persecution into an intelligence weapon, using Nazi surveillance capabilities against the regime itself. But perhaps the most remarkable achievement of the wartime cipher system was its role in protecting Jewish refugees throughout occupied Europe. Jesuit institutions had become part of an underground railroad that helped Jews escape Nazi persecution, and the cipher system was crucial to coordinating these rescue operations. Safe houses could be identified through coded references in apparently innocent religious correspondence. Escape routes were planned using mathematical formulas embedded in theological discussions. Even the timing of rescue operations was coordinated through astronomical references that appeared in routine academic papers. The moral dimension of these operations added another layer of complexity to the cipher system. Information about refugee movements required absolute security, but it also needed to be accessible to humanitarian workers who might not have extensive cryptographic training. The solution was the development of what Jesuits called compassionate ciphering, simplified encoding methods that could be learned quickly by non-specialists while still providing adequate security for life and death communications. These wartime innovations proved that the Jesuit cipher was more than just a communication tool. It had become a moral technology, a system that could encode not just information, but values and ethical commitments. The cipher carried within it the accumulated wisdom of centuries of Jesuit thinking about the relationship between knowledge and responsibility, between intelligence and conscience. The end of World War II marked the beginning of the Cold War era, which would present new challenges and opportunities for the evolved cipher system. The emergence of electronic surveillance technologies, the development of computer-based cryptography, and the creation of professional intelligence agencies with vast resources would test the adaptability of methods that had been developed in an earlier technological age. Yet the Jesuits had always understood that their cipher system's greatest strength lay not in its technical sophistication, but in its integration with human networks that spanned continents and cultures. As governments struggled to adapt their intelligence operations to the realities of ideological conflict and nuclear deterrence, the Society of Jesus quietly continued to operate communication networks that had been functioning effectively for more than 4 centuries. The techniques they had pioneered, the organizational principles they had developed, and the ethical frameworks they had created would influence intelligence operations throughout the Cold War and beyond. Their cipher had not simply survived the transition to modernity. It had helped define what modern intelligence work would become, establishing patterns and precedents that continue to shape secret communication in the digital age. The transformation was complete. What had begun as a method for coordinating missionary activities had evolved into something far more significant. The Jesuit Cipher had become a template for understanding how information, properly managed and ethically applied, could serve as an instrument of human progress and global transformation. The Jesuit Cipher stands today not as a relic of history, but as a living testament to the power of information in human hands. For nearly 5 centuries, this secret language has shaped the world from shadows, proving that knowledge, when properly protected and ethically wielded, can be more transformative than armies or gold. From the candlelit crypt of Montmartre to the digital networks of the modern age, the Society of Jesus has demonstrated that true influence comes not from force, but from understanding. Their cipher remains unbroken, not because it cannot be decoded, but because it continues to evolve, adapt, and serve purposes that transcend any single age or empire. The secret language endures, whispering still in corridors of power, reminding us that the greatest mysteries are of 10 hidden in plain sight, waiting for those wise enough to listen.